Mr. Downer, you said so much, this is in relation to your opening remarks on Mr. Howard and Robert Menzies. So much of what I've said seems self-evident in retrospect, but at the time, the values and policies of Menzies and Howard were ridiculed and attacked by their political opponents. The reason they seem self-evident now is because both Menzies and Howard won the political debates of their time. Do you think we've not been working hard enough to win debates?
Well, I think there's, I don't want to criticise subsequent Liberal governments, or I'm looking at Josh a bit here, sheepishly, as I should, and he's looking at me rather harshly, I'd have to say. I mean, they had particular circumstances to deal with which were very, very difficult. I mean, dealing with a pandemic, you'd have to say, threw every government off the tracks. I've seen that in the UK with the Tory government, with the Boris Johnson government. I suppose my big point, looking at state Liberal governments and oppositions as well as the federal Liberal Party, is not to criticise them, but to say that the challenge for them is to win the intellectual debate, not just to be seen to be managers. I think one of the reasons, I think the liberal values, as you might call them, capital L liberal values, the values of liberal democracy, are timeless. I think they're timeless, and I think they are incredibly popular. And I think they can be articulated to young people in ways that really interest and excite young people. But if all you're about is management, and we would manage, the hospitals better, or the roads better, or, we'd something to do with the budget, we'd manage it better than the Labor Party. Do you know what? It's not enough. It's not enough of an argument to say that. You have to be about something. I mean, there has to be a point to you. Not just I'm a manager, and we can get in managers, we can hire managers, we can contract that work out. It's not just about managing. It's about having values and beliefs that inspire people. People don't remember whether Ronald Reagan a good manager or a bad manager. Honestly, I think he was probably not a very good manager. Ronald Reagan probably wasn't hired by the American people to be a manager. He was inspiring. He inspired people to do things. And I mean, I think Margaret Thatcher would have been quite a good manager, actually. But she wasn't hired by the British people to be a manager. She was hired because of her values and the way she encapsulated traditional British values and re-articulated them in a way that inspired people. My point is Menzies and Howard did that. And they were absolutely rubbished. I mean, I can remember as a small child how Menzies was attacked, endlessly attacked. Howard attacked we were too close to the Americans. What was a conga line of, I can't remember it's gone out of my head. Conga line of something not very nice. Sucking up to the Americans. Just stick with it. The public shared our values, not the values of our critics, and that's it. I think that is missing a bit from politics, would be as far as I'd go, insofar as I was suggesting any criticism of my successors. What are their values? What do they stand for? Not are they good managers or not.
Can I just throw in something here? I think we have this very issue represented by the emerging debate on the government's energy policy. What the government is proposing, and the reaction puts me in mind of the endless debate of 30 plus years ago about government controls on interest rates. People used to say, if you control interest rates, we'll keep money affordable for small business people, for home buyers and farmers, and won't that be good? And on the face of it, it sounded a very good idea to have interest rate controls, and silly people who wanted to get rid of them, such as the members of the Campbell Committee and myself and quite a number of other people, argued that if you kept artificial controls on interest rates at a time when banks were desperately trying to attract funds, you'd only aggravate the problem. Because you'd be able to say, well, there'll be money available at this artificially low interest rate. The only problem is there won't be any money available because the banks weren't able to attract it. And I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot of parallel in that and what the government is proposing at the moment. It is screamingly obvious to all of us that we ought to be increasing the supply of gas. And you could start by removing the controls on exploration for gas in states such as Victoria, and so the argument goes on. Now that is an issue that I'm glad that that Mr. Peter Dutton has taken the stance he has, and I look forward to them. But it's got to be prosecuted by reminding people that if you artificially suppress the price of something, you will discourage investment. And just as people wouldn't send their money to banks, they sought better returns in things like cash management trusts, were in fact created because of the controls on interest rates. And I remember that debate extremely well because it had internal ramifications in the then government as well as an external reach. And I think it's very, very important to reach back in history and remember the parallels that do exist.
But it does get to the values question. I mean, what's the Liberal Party about? Does it think it's okay now to start regulating gas prices?
We don't, obviously, self-evidently we don't, but we have to go the step further and point out the consequence. If we try and regulate circumstances where we shouldn't, then there will be even less gas available because people won't invest to search for it. I mean, why would you? Why would you bother? In the same way as people would say, well, please, we believe in having home ownership affordable, but unfortunately we can't make any money available at these attractively low interest rates because there's no money.
Michael Costa, you remember, the former Labor Treasurer of New South Wales, once said he was going to write a book called I'm Fat and Ugly, What's the Government Going to Do About It? There does seem to be a tendency now, which the Andrews government is playing into, and I think the Albanese government, that people expect government to do things. They are very comfortable with the idea that the state steps in to regulate gas prices. They're comfortable with the idea in Victoria that the state takes over the role it once decided was a good idea to give to the private sector to run the energy sector. Has the zeitgeist changed, or are we just not making the point strongly enough that the best thing and the most important thing a government should do is to empower individuals and private enterprise?
Well, this is the whole point that I'm making. I mean, if you concede the ground to people who make those arguments and you never make the contrary arguments, and all you really do is decide if you look at the polls, it's too popular, that position, we might as well just adopt it ourselves, then after all, and that in the end, you end up by standing for nothing and being irrelevant. You've got to make the arguments. I mean, there's a point where you have to say to people, it's funny, the title of Michael Costa's non-book, but a funny point to me, a funny way of making an important point. And you see this in the UK where I live as well, the constant demands on the BBC for the government to solve every imaginable problem in society. I mean, it does get to where the people, not so much, you can't call anyone ugly anymore. You can think it, but you can't say it. And you can't call them fat, by the way, either. I had to call them fat. You can't call people fat, even though they're enormous. You can't say that.
What about less hair? Could you say that?
I think there must be some term for that. But But you do hear this in the UK the whole time. I mean, what's the government doing about obesity? What is the obesity strategy? What's the Tory party's obesity strategy? I mean, where does it end? Where does it end? Does anyone say, where does this end? I mean, we can't just keep controlling every individual's behaviour. But my whole point is that it disappoints me that so few people are prepared to make the counter-arguments.
No, like, if this is a question about... Look, I agree with Alexander. I mean, the essence of success in politics lies in having the right values, the right policies, but above all of that, a capacity to win an argument. Unless you can win the argument, and you know, my belief, and this may not be a nice thing to say at the University of Melbourne in the presence of a predominantly Victorian audience, but my belief is that, loathe him as most of you do, Daniel Andrews is a very good communicator. He really is. He is an extremely effective communicator, and he transmits conviction. I mean, I abhor his policies, but he does stand his ground, and it's. I mean, he's done it in a different style, but he's the most effective. You know, in my time, and Neville Rand was an extremely good communicator. He had a greater thespian characteristics and so forth, and he was a smoother operator. But Andrews is a very good communicator, and I think we have to recognise that. That's no reflection on his opponents, and I mean, like everybody else, I'll do anything I can to help John and his team in the task that lies ahead. But we have to recognise, and what people in the end, I think, saw in him was somebody who was absolutely determined, kept repeating what he believed in, and drip, 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 it had an impact. And I think that more than anything else is the explanation as to why.
It's convictions too.
Yeah,
I mean, we might not have liked his convictions.
No,
but tell you what, he sold them to the public.
Yeah, he did, and that's my
and
point.
he seemed strong and decisive.
And the answer, of course, is not to adopt the convictions we abhor. And the answer is not to adopt the convictions we abhor, but rather to recognise there's nothing more effective in public life, whether it's in the age of social media or not, than the power to present an argument and to win the debate. And you really have to do that time and time again. Unless you do that, we're dead. Collectively speaking. I don't mean individually, I mean we'll survive, but that's my opinion. Can I ask him a question now? Alexander, I wanted to talk about China. It obviously is the big international challenge. Do you subscribe to the theory that we run the risk of being mesmerised by China? That we don't understand just how close we are to a situation where, I mean, I think the last couple of months have been fascinating around the world. There's no group of people in the world I admire more at the moment than the women of Iran. I think they're, I'd like to hear, the self-proclaimed feminist shouting at the rooftops how much they admire. But the other fascinating thing is what's happening in China. The reaction of the government to the rejection of aspects of COVID. Now, the truth is that China is an ageing population. Estimates made by Chinese institutions suggest that if the present fertility rate is maintained, by the end of this century, which you and I won't see, Alexander, the end of this century, China's population will be at about 700 million. you compare China with India, which is complete reverse. India's got a very youthful population. Think of all those fast bowlers that are going to be produced. Forgive that obsession of mine, but I think we do run the risk of being a little mesmerised by China, that perhaps Xi's iron grip is not quite as strong, and secondly, that fundamental problem of growing old before you grow rich, which did not bedevil Japan. Japan was rich when her demographic path altered. And what do you think of that?
So I think several things about that. First of all, I think the working age population in China is now declining. I think secondly, I said to some people in London the other day who were shocked to hear me say this, I think relative to the West and the United States, we've reached peak China. I don't think China's relative position is going to grow beyond what it is now. So in that sense, I don't think we should be mesmerised by China, but we shouldn't be complacent. So I've made this point actually in my lecture. A lot of commentators draw a sort of straight line trajectory about China. Well, if China continues to develop as it's doing now, by 2030 this will have happened, and by 2050, well, of course, it'll be net zero by then, won't it? 2050, I forgot. Net zero human activity. By 2050, it'll be something else. I mean, I think this is completely wrong. And it's not just the demographics of China, though importantly it is partly about the demographics of China. It's about the policies of the Chinese government. I mean, the Deng Xiaoping reforms from the late 1970s through Deng Xiaoping himself, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, they had a constant policy of building a more competitive, internally competitive economy, privatizing many components of the economy, and integrating their economy as best they could in the international community. And Xi Jinping has changed that. He has started to renationalise, a bit like Dan Andrews, renationalise the economy, engage less with the rest of the world. There's some issues there about the rest of the world as well, but engage less with the rest of the world. Adopt, if you like, more restrictive and more socialist policies, which in the end are going to lead to a less efficient distribution of capital and economic activity, slower rates of growth, and I think are going to therefore inhibit China's capacity relatively to exercise influence over the world. So I do think we have reached peak China. It's really saying the same thing as you're saying, but I think the way to look at it is we've reached peak China, but China's not going away. There are still going to be 1 billion, 1.3, whatever it is now, for the rest of our lives, about 1 billion people in China. It's going to be hugely important. They invest massively in technology, though they're going to be limited because of the cyber conflict they've got into with the West and the decisions that particularly the Americans and then their allies have made not to allow super chips to be, the most sophisticated chips to be exported to China. That is going to limit their capacity in areas like AI, artificial intelligence, quantum computing and so on. And that might be a good idea to limit them. So, yeah, I think we have reached peak China. That would be how I would put it. I don't think we have to fear China, but we have to exist with China, but we have to balance China's power as well. And by the way, just make one other point. Xi Jinping's foreign policy has been as disastrous as any government's foreign policy that I have seen in a very long time. It's been a disastrous foreign policy because all he has done is unite the liberal democracies against him and against China. And then who did he get into bed with in February? He got into bed with Vladimir Putin. He backed Putin, and look at the mess that Putin has got himself into, to the point where China is now clearly a little embarrassed about the relationship with Russia. So their foreign policy has been completely counterproductive, and that has also limited China's influence and power.
On Putin, if you had been Secretary of State in the United States over the 2 years leading up to Putin's special military operation in the Ukraine, what would you have done differently from what the Americans did or failed to do?
I would have done, I said this to Ben Wallace, the British Foreign Secretary, before Putin invaded, so I can say that I put my view forward, not to the Americans.
I didn't know that, so that's not a Dorothy Dix question.
I said to Ben...
You make it sound like one.
No, not at all. I think you had to tell the Russians, you had to tell Putin, that if they actually went ahead and invaded Ukraine, we would provide military support to Ukraine, and we would make sure, even if the Ukrainians were to do the fighting, I would have made that point to Putin, but would have made sure Ukraine could not be defeated. And that you, Mr. President, you know, with the greatest of respect, and I know you're such a kindly and wonderful man, you must understand the importance for us of maintaining international law, the rules-based system. You cannot think that we would allow you with impunity to get away with invasion. So the Americans did say, Americans and their allies did say to the Russians, there'll be a whole raft of different sanctions on you. But they didn't say, they didn't telegraph that they would provide the degree of military assistance they have provided. I'd have told them that straight, I would have told Putin that straight up front. Look, mate, it's not going to happen, this. You're going to get into a huge confrontation with us. But the Americans and their allies were frightened of Russia's nuclear capabilities. I think that's why they didn't do it. Well, you know, what was it that Donald Rumsfeld used to say? Weakness, he's a great man, that Donald Rumsfeld, weakness is provocative.
It can sometimes be provocative.
Why do you say sometimes? Why do you say sometimes? I know why you're saying that. But Putin, it reminds me of Putin. In 2007, he came to Sydney, and we had a meeting with him. The left, I notice on social media, like to have the photograph of John Howard and me standing with Vladimir Putin and the head of their nuclear program signing a nuclear agreement, as in a uranium supply agreement with the Russians during this visit. But we had a meeting of some members of the National Security Committee and the Prime Minister with Putin, and Sergei Lavrov, his foreign minister, was then and still is. And I gave Putin a wonderful magnum of Grange Hermitage. And I said, you know, I'm a South Australian, Mr. President, and I said, this is the greatest wine from my state that Australia produces. And he took one look at it, grabbed the bottle by the neck, and just handed it to an aide and said nothing, not even a thank you. So you can imagine what I think of Vladimir Putin.
One final, we could go on all night, but we're running out of time.
Yep.
One final quick question, which I want a quick, redemptive, uplifting, hopeful answer to. The state of the Conservative movement in Australia, we are out of out of 9 state, territory and federal governments, we are in power in 2, in opposition in 7. In Britain, the Conservative Party is in power, but only just. If they had 3-year terms, you'd think they would be not in power for very long. In the United States, the Republicans should be resurgent and in the ascendant, but we saw in the midterm elections that they are not. The state of the Conservative movement worldwide, is it cyclical or terminal?
Well, it's certainly not terminal. I mean, we've faced this problem before. When we lost in 2007, we were out of office everywhere. And I remember when we won back power in 2013, people was talking about the existential threat to the Labor Party. And I mean, I just think that is nonsense. And I think we have to be bold enough to say that and to quote, the sort of relevant past comparisons. As far as the conservatism in America is concerned, the biggest single problem is that the American political system does not enable the Republican Party to summon the backbone until the primaries start. I mean, the clear problem with the Republicans is Trump. I mean, if I'd have been an American, I'd have voted on balance for Trump in the 2020 election, but his behaviour after it was so reprehensible and unacceptable. I mean, you've got to, when the umpire gives you out and you fail on the DRS, you've got to leave the field. And that's the reality. So I think the British Conservative, I mean, at least the parliamentary system, and this is a very important point for all of us, at least the parliamentary system does enable you to solve things. I mean, they've finally settled on Rishi. Okay, everybody thinks they're doomed. I'm not sure that they're doomed. I'm not sure about that at all. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. And as far as we're concerned, well, I repeat again, in 2007, everybody, was talking about when do we go to the funeral sort of thing, and it wasn't that. So I just think we have to keep our heads on that issue and get some good new candidates, but also get a couple of people in this room back in federal parliament.
Yeah, so
And some new people.
I kind of agree with all of that. I just make a couple of other comments. It goes back to what I was saying in my lecture. You must get out there and make the arguments based on your values and explain your values. You're not going to get back into power by just being managerialist. You've got to inspire people. And I actually think that, Conservative, or in Australia we would say liberal values, are very popular. But you have to talk to people in those terms, and you have to make sure your policies fit your values. You're not making... Look, if you look as though all you're doing is following opinion polls, the public will be onto you. The public will onto you in a flash. They know you don't really think that, or you don't really believe that, you're just saying it. Menzies didn't just follow opinion polls. Menzies led the opinion polls. I think Trump has done huge damage to the global conservative movement, by the way. But I'm sort of a trenchant opponent of Donald Trump. I thought some of his policies, by the way, were quite good. But his personal behaviour makes him ineligible to serve in high office, in my view.
Public grace.
You can't behave like that and be the president of a country, particularly a major country. Even the president of Colombia would be unacceptable to behave. Or Peru, right? Peru. They had a bit of trouble with their president.
Colombia had a very good president.
Good and bad.
No,
good and bad. The present one's not so good.
Very good one.
The one who got the Congressional Medal or whatever it is that you got.
Presidential Medal of Freedom.
That's right, something. Just to say, because I do live in the UK, for the Conservative Party, I think John is right. They are in huge trouble electorally, but there are 2 years to go. Rishi Sunak is a very smart guy. And they do know that they have to argue their values, and they do know they have to work on opposing the Labour Party. I think the Labour leader there is a guy called Keir Starmer. He's a fairly uninteresting kind of personality in a way, but he's seen to be safe. He's made a couple of mistakes, policy mistakes recently that the media haven't focused on as mistakes, and one of them is to say that he'll take away the tax-free status of private schools, which for aspirational families, it sends a very negative message. And secondly, this is hard to explain to an Australian audience, really, because perhaps we instinctively would all agree with him, but he wants to institute substantial constitutional change, which includes abolishing the House of Lords. That's what I thought you might think is a reasonable and fair thing, and replacing it, would you believe it, with an upper house which would be representative of the different regions of the UK. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? I call that parliamentary deadlock, and devolving a lot of power to the regions, as though these sort of local mayors and local governments would be filled with the most admirable and virtuous people compared to the national government. I hate to say it to those of you who are involved in state politics, but this couldn't be less true. And our whole experience of federation and devolution is that it's a tough show to run that. I think going to the British public and saying, I'm going to give you constitutional upheaval, and I'm going to tax all the independent schools, are signs that this isn't necessarily going in 2 years' time to be an election the Conservatives will automatically lose. They may not.
It just remains on this final Menzies Research Centre event of 2022 to thank you all for your support this year. It's been terrific and encouraging to have so many events like this so well attended. Thank you to my staff, thank you to Amanda, thank you to our hosts, the Robert Menzies Institute, and Georgina Downer and her wonderful team, Sam, Zach, for having us here. But most of all, thank you to Mr. Downer for a very thought-provoking 10th John Howard lecture, which will be online at the Menzies Research Centre, www.menziesrc.org, just as soon as we can get it up. And finally, Mr. Howard, thank you for gracing us with your presence. Thank you for your amusing and insightful conversation. And we look forward to hosting the 11th John Howard lecture with you next year. Thank you.
Thank you.